All right, the time is 2:10 p.m. We have a quorum of this committee, and this meeting has been duly posted. Good afternoon and welcome to the Procurement Ad Hoc Committee meeting of the Dallas Independent School Board of Trustees. Please stand and join us for a moment of silence and remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance and the salute to the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Honor the Texas flag. One state, under God, one and indivisible. I would like to recognize the ad hoc committee members that are present. We have Trustee Joyce Foreman, Trustee Edwin Flores, and I, Ben Mackey, the committee chair. We have no other trustees in attendance, and I'd also like to recognize our superintendent of schools, Michael Hinojosa. The board will now retire to closed session. The public is welcome to wait in the room where the board is in closed session. The board will retire to closed session pursuant to the Texas Government Code Section 551 concerning any and all purposes permitted by the Act, including but not limited to the following sections. 551.071 for private consultation with his attorney about pending or contemplated litigation or on a matter in which the duty of the attorney to the governmental body under the Texas Disciplinary Rules of Professional Conduct in the State Bar of Texas clearly conflicts with this chapter, including ongoing procurement, compliance, review, update. The time is now 2:12 p.m. and we are in closed session.
make them real, that makes them real productive.
Your blood is going.
That's right.
You're not falling asleep. Hey, Doc, do you remember when Joe May used to fall asleep during the board meetings? He had his glasses. Because they only had like one, the glasses only had like one thing.
And remember, he had a paper clip on the
Yeah.
corner of it?
That was his favorite glasses.
Those were his only glasses. Oh, man, you're hardcore.
Hey, man.
You cause a guy to drink coffee and eat chocolate and drink. Oh, today's Marissa's birthday.
Oh, tell her happy birthday for me.
We should take a happy birthday selfie. What does a happy birthday selfie look like?
It's like any other selfie.
She's in class right now. I was talking to her. She was walking in class.
When she responds, tell her don't text her in class.
What?
When she responds, tell her don't text. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
The time is now 3:01 PM, and we are back in open session. The board took no action in closed session. So we are going to move on to item 4.01, discussion of the ad hoc committee scope. This was formed out of a need to look at our procurement procedures and consider policy revisions, as well as look at the overall scope of the department, anything that needs to get changed and moved. The next two items will be discussion of the proposed board policies and the next steps. So I don't think we need anything else in 4.01. So we're going to move on to 4.02, discussion of proposed changes to board policies related to procurement, and start with those. And in looking at these proposed changes, I think it would be helpful if we start with one policy, kind of go through each of the points. And then if we can, pause for any questions, thoughts, concerns, comments from the committee members and discussion, and then continue to move through them.
Yes, sir. All right, so we're pulling up CH local. It doesn't look like revised. Well, I'm trying, it says revised, but we need to get the red line on there. But as we move, let's just start at the top and I'll move through there. Okay, so the first paragraph, basically we would strike because it indicates that the board has adopted these rules and procedures for acquisition of goods and services, which is clearly identified at the bottom with the date the board approves it. So we saw this, no need to have that. On paragraph 3, one of the items that we added was 50% is owned and controlled. That's what,
Yeah, it's not on this. I'm clicking on the comments. It doesn't have the comments on this one, so.
I don't need the comments, I just need the red line. Takes an attorney to do it. All right. So, as I mentioned on the on paragraph 3, we identified owned and controlled, and at the end of that paragraph, we identified, instead of listing the minority groups, we just listed those that were certified by organizations recognized in the policy, which those organizations are recognized the policy on page 20, with the idea that, for instance, as we have them listed there, there may be other groups that are now identified, such as veterans, that are now recognized as a minority business. Do you want to do questions or go?
I do.
Yeah, we can, after each changes, if you just stop. And
Okay, sorry.
So there are a couple of concerns, starting with the 51% owned and controlled. How do we address that? Since we are not a certifying agency, are we going to ask all of our certifying agencies if they currently have that policy? And if not, do we no longer use that certifying agency because they do not have the 51% controlled and operated? Because controlled is one terminology and operated is a different function.
That's correct. And so what we can do is we can inquire of those entities on page 20 as to their certification process, if they identify those two things. What we were trying to do is match our policy to what's in our MWB guidelines on the website, and as well as be able to make sure that there is no question that they need to be both instead of. So to your question as to whether we would eliminate a vendor, we haven't proposed to do any of that. It's not a vendor, I'm sorry, as a certification body, we haven't proposed to do that, but we would have the ability to be able to question if something was to come up as to whether that company was really controlled. We'd be able to pursue that where we don't believe our current policy allows us to do that.
So I still have some concern as to controlled and operated, because someone can control a company by 51% ownership. It happens every day, but they're not the day-to-day operator. So are we limiting ourselves by using that kind of terminology?
And we can definitely.
And are other quasi-governmental entities using the same terminology?
And we can definitely look at that. Our goal was to try to eliminate the possibility of someone saying they are the owner of the company, and to get the identification of MWB, but really they were just the front person and somebody else was really running the show.
Well,
And we can.
I would strongly suggest that our other agencies, partner governmental agencies like the City of Dallas, DART, NTTA, all of those agencies already have worked out some of these issues, and I would strongly suggest that there be conversations with them regarding this whole piece instead of trying to reinvent on our own. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to get into a position where we get rid of some of our certifying agencies. That would mean that we would have fewer minority vendors coming to us and participating. And I don't think that's the intent or the spirit of this, but it could be the outcome if we're not careful.
I understand. And we definitely have do have the information from those other entities. We can review it in relation to this policy.
Trustee Flores.
Thank you. So I'm in favor of, switching to those organizations that are recognized, in the policy later on down below, because as you say, who is recognized, to be able to get this kind of preference that definition is expanding A, and B, I'm totally for owned and controlled. I think that this is just basic, business 101. I mean, if you're not controlling the business, if you don't own it and you don't control it, then it's a sham. And I think that that's what we're trying to make sure that we, don't allow, and therefore I'm for these two changes. Thank you.
And go ahead, Trustee Flores. Or sorry, Foreman.
What I just want to make sure that I'm clear, because what I heard from trustee Flores is he's not clear on what I said. I said there are two different things that we're talking about. You can be the owner, you can be the controller, but you don't have to be the day-to-day operational person. And I think we missed each other. I too don't want shams, but what I do not want to do is put ourselves in a position where we are eliminating qualified minority-owned firms that have been certified by certifying agencies that we have depended on for years.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the only question I have is, so we're not proposing removal of any certifying agencies?
No, sir, we are not.
Okay. All right, that's all I have. We can continue.
Okay. So the next paragraph, basically, we just eliminated the MWE guidelines. The policy clearly references the guidelines that for purchases and transactions. So it was a duplicate to have see the guidelines for details when that was referenced before. The next one, we would remove on the next paragraph of requirements and intent of MWB program or binding and material to all departments. We would move that to the MWB program guide. The next paragraph, basically, we discussed before, we were going to remove that since our disparity study has to be redone. And once we'll have that information, we'll be up to date on that portion of the disparity study and the parts that go with that, but all that information can go into the program guidelines from there. The last paragraph on that page should also be in program guidelines, not in board policy. And I think you're going to find that the majority of things in the notes in relation to those policy changes is to identify those things in the MWBE or procurement guidelines. So on page 2, the first 3 paragraphs again is on vendor relations, and it should be moved to CHE local, where the vendor relations information is identified. So what we're actually asking is, would we be making a change from CH to CHE local on those three paragraphs? So they wouldn't be eliminated, but they would be removed from this policy. Then the next 2 paragraphs, all of that already is in CHE local, so it's a duplication. So we would remove those 2 paragraphs, because it already exists in other policy.
Okay, let's pause there.
Okay.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
So just a question on, and this is the last paragraph on page 1.
Yes, ma'am.
And where did we say we were moving that? To the program guidelines?
Yes.
So the purchasing department in conjunction with the MWBE department shall actively foster relationships with minority and women businesses to encourage participation. We're moving that kind of language out of the policy.
That was our recommendation, yes, ma'am.
And so why would we do that?
Well, we felt it was better to be in the program guide and the purchasing policy or purchasing manual than not in the policy.
And so I would strongly suggest that that remains in a part of our policy. That's part of who we should be as a district with MWBE participation, is to strongly work with the purchasing department and the MWBE department, because we know that the MWBE department doesn't purchase anything. And so they have to work in conjunctions with purchasing, and I think that should remain a part of our policy.
Okay.
I think one of the things I have concerns about when you look at the words actively foster. That's in policy. How do you define, how do you determine what actively foster means? So that's typically language that's found in a guidebook and not necessarily in a policy.
So if we want to remove the words actively foster, I would not have a problem with that, but I think that we have to be continued and reminded that part of our responsibility is, for me, is to ensure that ethnic minorities and women get an opportunity to do business with the district. And we should not be shying away from nor walking away from that.
In the policy, we're not changing any of those goals.
Yeah, I know we're not changing the goals, but we're changing language. And when you change language, you know how that works. And so the superintendent has a problem with actively foster, so take actively out and say foster, or work together, or some other terminology that would make him more comfortable with that. But I think we should remember that part of our responsibility is MWBE participation.
Trustee Flores, you have anything?
We're using
So-
taxpayer
so-
money.
My point of view is that we need to be providing the best possible education to children, and we're here for the students and providing the best teachers and the best support for them. I don't see it as any kind of responsibility of the district. Something nice if we do it. I support it. I don't think that it's something that we need to have in, title and verse and policy. I think it's actually negative for the district. I'm all for keeping just that in our policy that says that the administration, shall have guidelines for purchasing and for MWBE. Thank you.
A question, does taking this out or leaving it in policy, because I do agree that words matter and what we put forward does show our values, et cetera, even if it doesn't come with like some specific thing that we must do. To Trustee Foreman's point and Superintendent Hinojosa's concern that this is, how do you measure that, how do you think about that? Does leaving this in or taking this out change any of the operations in which how we operate?
Absolutely not. We have our goals of 30 and 35% that are going to remain whether this is in the language or not. What we're trying to do was clear up and revise the policy as a whole. So I have heard the suggestions. We can look at other wording to potentially have that in there or not. We'll discuss that with the committee and see where we can go from there. But as far as the operation goes, we know what our goals are, and this in or out doesn't change that.
Okay, I think that would be wonderful to think about a way to put forth what is important to us, and some of this relationship and making sure we have that on a regular basis is important, at least in my opinion. And I know in like something like AE Local, where we talk about, again, towards the bottom, what's important to us, to say that this is important. Or to Superintendent Hinojosa's point, if there is what does this look like? If we have an idea that this looks like meeting quarterly or whatever it happens to be, maybe writing that. But if you just take a look at that and see what might make sense as we go forward there.
Absolutely.
All right, you can carry on.
Any other questions on page 2? Okay. Page 3, page 4, and to the middle of page 5, we're proposing to move that to CHE local again with other vendor relations policy. So we're not eliminating it, we're moving it to CHE local.
Are you changing any of the wording?
No, ma'am. Our proposal was to move that to CHE local as is. Then once we get to formal complaints, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I want to talk about the next.
Okay. The next section on formal complaints, that one as well would be moved to CHE local. Then as you move,
Wait, this is where I want to leave.
Trustee Flores?
okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, just that, in the first sentence of vendor contact with board members, it says persons doing business, yada, yada. At the end of the sentence says, as described above. Well, we're deleting that part as described above and moving it to CHE local, so we just need to strike as described above and then put parentheses CHE local.
Can you help me with which paragraph? I'm sorry.
I'm missing it.
So that first sentence of, in the black, in the non-red line,
Okay, yes, sir. Okay,
I just said, since it's not described above anymore.
right, but
But
that,
it is in CHE, so just,
those, if those paragraphs are, if, the last two paragraphs are also, this is in CHE, so we would either leave it, we would probably strike the language in, and move this to CHE local, so it wouldn't be referencing nothing again, it would be in that policy.
So you're saying the 3 paragraphs that say vendor contact with board members that are currently not redlined here would be moved to CHE local?
Yes, no, I'm sorry.
I'm
The
just
vendor
sorry,
contract
I'm
with board
sorry to
members.
get too much in the weeds.
No, that's
It's just that
okay.
as described
That's what,
above,
that's what we need, is
should
for
really
you to ask
say
questions.
see CHE local,
Okay,
because that's where the restricted contact period is going to.
that's correct. What we were proposing for the vendor contact with board members would remain,
Right.
and the others would go to, but I,
Just take out above.
As
yes, I will
described
take out the above. I'll make that note. So any other questions on page 5? So from the bottom of page 5 to the top of page 6, our recommendation is to strike it or to move to DBD local.
Which one would does the administration have a recommendation on?
I mean, I would think we would strike it, but or the compromise that we had it would fit, if it fit anywhere, it would be in DBD local, but we'd prefer to strike it.
So why would we not want to speak to the fact of board members shall refrain from contacting persons seeking to do business with the district during the restricted period?
That's going to CHE local.
That's going to CHE.
Yes, ma'am. I'm referring to the last paragraph that carries over onto page 6.
Oh, okay.
And that's talking about gifts, and DBD does address that.
So you're saying DBD in
That's where that policy.
already addresses this, and so this is
It talks about,
duplicative?
it talks about receiving gifts.
Okay.
Okay.
So it could be added to that, or that's why we were saying it strike. It would be struck because that policy already addressed what you can and cannot do.
Okay.
So on page 6, the instructional services approval and technology services approval, we'd move that to the purchasing manual to remove it from policy. We would leave the E-rate compliance, officer approval required. We would leave the title of construction, but just say CV local, because that's what dictates construction. And then on the last paragraph is purchasing authority. And this is a change that is suggested from TASBO to help increase the speed and flexibility of procurement. So basically, it says, except otherwise authorized by law, the board delegates to the superintendent or designee the method of purchasing that provides the best value for the district for all purchases valued at $50,000 or more in the aggregate for the year. And then you see we strike the relation to construction contracts.
So explain that to me again, because I'm not understanding what that does different than what we're doing. The superintendent, the administration currently decides the procurement process from purchasing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so why are we talking about authority when he already has the authority to do that based on the current process?
I would need to, as I review that, it just says that's designated by the board, not we're adding the delegates to the superintendent of schools of designees. So currently, our policy says that choice of procurement is designated by the board. It doesn't give us, I know what we're doing, but it doesn't in policy give us, it doesn't say that in policy.
So if it doesn't say that in policy, then how are we doing it?
That's what our practice has been, and that's what we're trying to clear up.
And I think the only place that we have a question about that has been in construction and based on the construction methodology.
Right, and
I have a real concern. Again, I have said to you guys over and over and over that this is based on construction. I have a problem with that, because that is an end around to go to a specific construction kind of procurement that you guys have tried to do for the last year and a half. That is an end around, and I think that is wrong. I think the board has voted on the way that we do construction procurement. And this is another end around to that, and I have a real serious problem with that.
well, I don't believe that was our intent.
But that's the way it's coming across.
But what we could do is take a look at, with that concern, we could take a look at if there's wording that makes it specific, because CV, as we went through this, CV is what dictates construction. And this is for all other purchases or procurement. So I believe in CV, and I would have to find it, but it specifically says that we'd have to come for the method to the board. They're exclusive. So if we could come up with wording that excluded construction from that designation, that could make it clearer?
That would make it better for me.
Okay. And that's exactly what we intended to do.
Thank you.
Do you have anything? So quick clarifying question on that from me. So currently, what the way this policy reads is, that the superintendent and the administration can determine the method of purchasing, except for construction contracts, which is governed separately in CV local. Is that currently the way this rate, before it changes?
The way it currently reads is the board sets the procurement method for goods and services and everything.
Everything.
Yes, sir. And what we've been doing for numerous years is the administration does that for goods or services, and then the CV dictates the delivery method for construction.
So currently, our policy is inconsistent with our practice.
Yes, sir.
And so this is to align that.
Yes, sir.
And by striking the line around construction contracts should be governed by CV local, by striking this here, even if we still have the CV local policy, that if we had it in CV where it addresses construction contracts, this doesn't override it, right? We would still follow CV local.
We still have CV local, but we can add clarification. I have no issue with trying to come up with clarifying language that made clear that CV local still has that authority in relation to construction.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, moving on to page 7. Trying to make sure I follow the notes here. We changed the word from shall to may. No, I believe that's correct. Trying to follow my notes here.
Is that on the first paragraph?
The second paragraph, to assist the board, the superintendent of schools or designate the.
I got you.
Yeah, okay.
Because
so-
of the
yeah,
prior
sorry.
recommendation.
Okay, so that goes to, sorry, I'm trying to follow the notes here. So the next paragraph on board approval is changing the amount to $250,000, which is a TASB recommendation on page 8 of the TASBO, sorry. So,
I have a question about that.
okay. You need to fix my eyes to make it easier to see.
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes
I'm
it's
just
hard.
like, be taking my glasses
So-
on and off.
So I have a concern about changing to $250,000 without board approval. Because I've seen when we went from $50,000 to $150,000, and I can tell you, I've seen a lot of 149, 990s, 999s. That is a concern. That is a real concern, is that we keep upping the ante on what doesn't come to the board, when the board is ultimately held responsible for the fiduciary responsibility of this district. So I have a real serious problem with upping that ante. I have a real serious problem.
So,
Because that just means that if you keep things under $250,000, you don't come to the board. The board doesn't see it. And I've got some concerns about some of the stuff we've done that's even $50,000 that did not come to the board. And I've made that clear, is that is a problem.
so if, in response to that, what I misspoke, that we were raising it from 150 to 250, that was the recommendation of TASBO. We have left it, we highlighted it on the sheet I'm looking at now that I can read. We highlighted it, but we did not take the TASBO recommendation that suggested it go to 250.
I still don't like 150, but I'm about to have a stroke over 250.
I just want, what our attempt was to show what the recommendation was, that, so it related to policy, and that you would be aware that it's either changed or wasn't changed. And in this case, we proposed to leave it at 150.
Could you
Now,
put something in place to catch those 149, 999s?
now, we did have, we did strike the next line, which relates to that, or shall provide a list of approved contracts from 50,000 to 149.99 to the board as an information item.
So why did we strike that?
We're providing each contract, but also, we're also providing a complete list of every transaction that we do that are non-payroll related items in the actual payments. You can see those that do or don't have, that were either through a purchase order or those that were a check. We submit that to the board every single month in those transactions. And just on that note, I hope you noticed that over the last several months, that the number of checks that have been issued without a purchase order has drastically decreased, and particularly the number that are between the 50 and 149,999. So we are internally making efforts to eliminate that.
So where are you providing that information? Because I've missed it.
In the monthly, each board meeting in the monthly, we have a list of checks. And so if, to every vendor that we, regardless of size, we have that in there. And there's a column that shows the check amount. And if, in the far right-hand column is the line that shows if there was not a purchase order. Generally, you're going to find that to be legal services or deductions from payroll and that sort of thing. But if it's on the far right-hand column of that report, it reflects whether there was a check or not, or a PO or not, excuse me.
All right, I've been missing that report, so you're going to have to point it out to me.
It was, I will,
please?
when we meet Tuesday, I'll bring one so you can
And
refresh your mind.
Tell
Yes,
me
ma'am.
where it is in our,
It's in the financial reporting,
Financial.
but it will be specifically listed in the checks,
okay,
the transactions.
okay, thank you.
Quick question on that. So this thing talks about the approved contracts at 50 to 149.99. Is that the same as the checks that you're referring to? Or is this a separate one?
If we had a contract for $149.99, we paid it, it would be reflected in that, on that list.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All contracts would be reflected on that list?
Regardless of size, yes, sir.
And is this something that, in
When-
striking this? go
No,
ahead.
it's just when paid, right? I mean, if we hadn't paid it yet, it wouldn't be reflected because we hadn't dispersed any funds for it yet.
By striking this language, are we, would we then stop doing that report?
No, sir. That's part of our standard report to the board.
Then just personally, I don't see any harm in leaving it there if we're going to continue to do it. It doesn't change any of the procedures, and it doesn't sound like we're trying to change those procedures.
We just don't
so.
provide a separate report. It's just that one on just contracts. Our reporting is on when the goods or services have been received and we make payment, where we don't have currently a current report of just contracts between that dollar amount
So I think,
before payment.
so
So this requires them to generate a new report
So
versus what they're
I
already
would be
giving
open
us.
to, I would like to, I would like to make sure that we continue to see that, and I think to trustee Foreman's point, I'm okay with reflecting the language to whatever is the most
Okay.
effective manner of doing that, so we can see that. That's fine with me, I think. If we're gonna continue to do it anywhere, let's just make the language reflect that.
Okay.
Well, I don't need a separate report on that, though. Anyone else? Okay. Carry on.
Okay. So under professional services, we are, this is in CH local. It's a statement of law, so it's already in that board policy. The next paragraph is a duplicate.
Before you go on, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Under signature authority, I thought the signature authority actually was either the board president on most of those documents, and now you're asking us to give that authority to the superintendent. So,
There's actually no changes to that section.
well, it's highlighted, that's why.
Yeah, it's just highlighted. The question that we had
So
was,
you're
should we move?
leaving it,
We highlighted to say, should we move it to a different section within the policy, but not to change it? My notes say, should we move it to the purchasing authority section above? But it was not to change or remove it. We were just having an internal conversation about, should we move it to a different section
okay.
within the policy? So use of professional services and consultants and reasons for limiting competition. We find that to be unnecessary because of state and federal law, so we were recommending removal. Any questions on page 7?
Well, on the professional services part, it speaks to the government code, and then it also talks about federally funded grants. Are they in fact used differently?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last
So
portion.
Are they used differently? So when you talk about, when you procure professional services, that's usually through a bid.
Or RFP, yes, ma'am.
So that's usually through a bid. But when you're using the grant funds, are you procuring it through an RFP also?
Federal funds are going to be subject to the CFR 200, which requires dollar thresholds to be met to go through that process. So lower dollar amounts don't have to go through competitive bids. I'm talking, through 10,000 and less, you don't have to solicit multiple competition quotes. But anything more than that, the law requires us to get competition. So again, this is all required by federal law.
Okay. But we're completely striking it, knowing that there is a difference in the two? Or are you trying to move it to another area?
No, ma'am, we were striking because law trumps this policy. Maybe the wrong choice of word, but,
So, I guess one of the things, yeah.
sorry,
Don't be.
overrides,
I'm
whatever.
always using the wrong choice of words, so you're good up in here. But this covers professional services valued at $150,000 or more in the aggregate. So what we're saying is professional services under $150,000 would not go through the procurement process?
Professional services are not subject to competition when you're using local funds. We do it traditionally through an RFQ, which qualifies the vendors as the best qualified vendors to do business with the district. When you use federal funds, you are required to solicit competition.
So I know the difference between an RFQ and an RFP, but you still qualify them under an RFQ, correct? And you still rank them under an RFQ, correct? And so I'm trying to find out,
I have a clarification. I think the note over here about the 150,000, which you're mentioning, the reason they're suggesting to strike it is because above it, on board approval, the 150,000, it already says it. So everything 150,000 and above already comes to us for board approval.
But-
And then this section says the 150,000 or above must come. That's what the comment says, that it's saying the exact same thing as we have in board approval.
Above, correct.
okay, all right.
So it's not like it's changing, it's just
Okay.
we're writing it twice. Page 8.
Page 8. Roll, get through page 8 for me. Okay, so in the middle of the section, what we did here was look at other school districts' policy in relation to waiver board approval and policies in an emergency, and struck through that middle section as it related to what other districts are doing and Texas Education Code. Then on, down at competitive bidding, we made reference, we added the reference both to CH Legal and CV Legal to make it clear where you see guidance in relating to competitive bidding.
So I have some questions and concerns. I do understand emergency procurement, but if there is no limit on the dollar amount that comes before the board, that means the superintendent can spend as much as he or she would like regarding, no,
They're already getting rid of me.
no, I'm not getting rid of you. But I'm just saying that with no board action, this says the superintendent can spend as much as the superintendent wants to spend if there is a declared emergency. Now, of course, we all know in emergencies that the superintendent has to act fast. But to give him unfettered controls in terms of dollar amounts and how much he's spending, and there's nothing to talk about how he comes back to the board regarding that spending, that is a concern.
I believe in CH Legal, it does refer to coming to the next meeting for ratification.
That's state law.
In CH Legal?
Yes, ma'am, that's the note I have.
Okay, so maybe we can in somewhere put this in a CH Legal,
We can do that.
where the superintendent has to come to the board for ratification, because no disrespect, but nope, you cannot spend it the way you want to.
Right, you will, and we, at the next board meeting, you'll see ratification information from our most recent
And that's fair.
emergency.
That's fair.
Any other questions on page 8? Page 9. Okay. Under sole source, we're changing the word from may to may be and to are to require additional supporting documentation as it relates to sole source. Right of rejection, we're eliminating that the bottom section of that. We either believe it should be eliminated or moved to the purchasing manual. And then finally on that page, we believe that, well, in the policy, it currently says that the protests, as they have been, come to me. We felt it'd be better to say protest according to the purchasing manual.
So, back to just the sole source items, this is kind of blurred, so I can't really see it. So do we currently have legal reviewing sole source procurement?
It's an option right now. So there are things that do go to legal, and there are some things that don't go to legal. It's going to be dependent on the size of the purchase more often than not.
Okay, and so what are we suggesting in terms of the word changing?
We're going from maybe to are.
All of them will go through legal if they bought in as a sole source?
Correct.
That's correct. Any other questions?
Hold on a second. I'm a slow reader. Okay, I'm good.
Okay, page 10.
So page 10 is a continuation of the protest process that we believe would go in the manual. Then the next section of responsibility for debt, we believe that that should be struck as it relates to the board.
Any questions on page 10?
Just on the protest being removed from policy, how will the vendors be able to understand their right to protest? They currently can go directly to policy and see that.
Right, and we would have our procurement manual online as well, so they'd be able to see it just like they do now. Instead of going to policy, they'd go to the procurement manual.
Is it online now?
I don't,
Right now, it's only on the intranet, only for internal employees, but we can put it on the website for outside people to view.
And I have some concern about that. I think the more that you're able to let people know what their rights are, the better off they are. And I would just have some concerns with restricting that from striking that from the policy.
Quick question. So striking that from the policy and moving it into the manual, part of that concern is around, do people have access to see what that is? Would we make this manual available to anyone?
that would be what we'd have to do is include it in our district website, which it's not now.
Okay. Okay, so I think maybe whether or not this stays or goes, I'm personally open to. But I think to that point, if it's necessary to make sure that people know that process is really critical, so maybe that stays in policy if that's the case, that people have access to it. All right, anything? Page 11.
So in unauthorized transactions, we were going to put that also in the procurement purchasing manual, but unauthorized transactions are addressed in DH local already. So it's a duplication, but we would also include that in the purchasing manual so it was clear, but it's in, as you can see, the bottom, it's, of that paragraph, it says CDH local, so we already have that addressed for the employees of unauthorized transactions.
Questions? 12.
So on page 12, the first, would you pull that up? The first section is contract amendments. And we struck the first section. I apologize, I don't have notes on that particular item.
The note says that it looks at Houston's policy and then proposes moving it to regulation.
So I have a question regarding that. Particularly contingency, a lot of times is based on construction contracts and the dollar amount. And there are specific ways that sometimes the contingencies are used, or sometimes contingencies are not used in regards to a contract.
That's correct.
And then that goes back into the general fund, but the board would never know that without some kind of regulation on how it's used and when the board gets to know that.
Generally, as you mentioned, contingencies are related to construction contracts. I guess there could be some that came out of the general fund for a maintenance type item, but generally it's going to be out of the bond fund. And you're correct, it rolls back into the fund if it's unused, and then they can use it on like purposes.
I think there has to be some wording regarding how the contingencies are used, so that the board will have some idea, because you don't want to set up a situation where you have a 10% contingency on a $50 million contract, and there's $5 million that maybe something else could be done on that particular project. And that's more of like construction in a school or something.
Correct. I'll take a look at, the committee will take a look at that page and the wording and see what we can come up with. And I apologize, I don't have, on that particular page, I don't have any notes to reference, so I'll have to go back and research that change.
All right. Trustee Flores?
Just Wayne, but just real quick, so, but if so just to use the example of the bond, if there's a contingency attached to a certain project, then that contingency is not necessary. The only thing we can spend it on is the bond. It can't be used on anything else because it's bond funds and they're only.
It can be spent on like purposes.
On a bond, on an allowable bond purpose only.
That's correct.
It couldn't be used for anything else.
That's correct.
Right, so just so it stay within the bond, it goes back into the pot of money that's part of the bond because.
And it could either be used for something at that campus, it could be used at another campus that's approved, or for another bondable type item that is now a need.
Right, but it stays in, A, it stays in the bond.
Yes, sir, it
B,
does.
and this is something that has come up a lot up in my political district, I'm sure that we've all heard this, that there was a project that they said, this project is, estimated to cost, this wing is gonna cost $22 million. It comes in, it turns out it's at, 19.5, right? So then there's like 2.5 left over, right? But then you're working in a different building down the street and you think that, we're just gonna replace this roof. And it turns out when you crack the thing open and you were gonna spend $500,000, you crack the thing open and suddenly you realize that, all the columns are gone, you have to replace all the windows. It's not just a simple, roof repair, you actually have to replace the whole thing and it costs you $2.5 million. Right, that's why when it goes back into the pot, that's what I tell at least my constituents. I said, look, just because it was originally estimated for this campus, and we came in under, that's awesome, because now that's 2.5 that gets thrown back into the pot that we're gonna use in a building where we discover something in a 50, 60-year-old building
Right.
that you didn't expect.
Because the
And so-
contingency generally is for unforeseen items after the bid.
Correct.
And so, and we'll probably see a lot of that with what we're about to experience with, when we start tearing into
Absolutely correct.
tornado-damaged areas,
Correct.
right? Because you can't see some of the damage that is currently there that we won't be able to see until we get in there.
Thank you.
All right, page 13.
So what we tried to clarify at the top of page 13 is if the amendment to the contract was in excess of 25% of the original amendment, it would have to be a separate procurement. We thought the contract or the current policy was vague on what to do over the 25%, so we clarified that. As you look at personal purchases, that's already addressed in CAA, so it's a duplicate. We were striking that. And then on the recovery cost of procurement and project management, we were not sure if that needed to be in policy. Then on revised contract provisions, we eliminated struck through the purchasing manager manual, and just went with standard contract forms.
Any questions?
I'm still trying to get my arms around the last sentence of 12. Unless expressly waived by the board, contract amendments that do not result in an aggregated increase exceeding 25% of the original contract amount shall be submitted to the board for approval.
That's correct.
Contract, and then it goes on, is this an add-on?
Yes, ma'am.
Contract amendments in excess of 25%, the amendment shall be submitted to, in a separate competitive procurement?
Yes, ma'am.
So so this is saying, and I'm assuming that we're still talking about construction, basically.
Well, it can be any contract amount, but generally, we're going to talk about construction. Yes, ma'am.
So we don't usually do contract amendments to goods and services or professional
I just didn't want to
services.
exclude anything from the conversation, but
I'm
yeah.
just trying to make sure
No, I'm with you, and
I
and generally, you're
internalize.
correct. We're talking about construction. I just don't want to limit it to that it applies to everything.
yeah, but I'm trying to make sure I get the good understanding.
So currently, what policy allows us is to make an adjustment or amendment presented to the board up to 25%. What we're suggesting, and that wasn't clear, was after 25%, if we need an adjustment up to 30%, then we need to separately procure that, which would also be presented to the board.
So I'm still trying to get, so you're working on a project, and there's something unforeseen, like a lot of our old buildings have. And you're saying that you would go back out for bid if it's
it was-
over 25%?
It was going to increase the contract over 25%.
So does that delay the project?
Well, I would anticipate, yes.
And so what would that cost be?
No, I don't know that we-
Theoretically, I'm
Right,
talking.
I mean, it would cost you time,
And time costs you what? Money.
sometimes, yes, ma'am.
So I would strongly suggest that you think about that.
So, and I'm good to go back to the committee with that. The question is, we need to come up with what is it if it's over 25%?
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but what I do know is if that you go back through a bidding process, you probably are going to delay the project.
There's no doubt about that.
And that is gonna cost you money.
So what we're trying to identify is what do you do for 26%?
I know what you're trying to do, and I know the spirit of what you're trying to do, but at the same time, I don't want to see us get in a situation where we're delaying a project based on trying to go back out for bid. Do we come up with a speedy way to go out for bid? I don't know the answer to that. But there has to be something different, because you don't want to start delaying projects based on going back out for bid. My opinion.
Trustee Flores.
So, two things. When I'd read this, I was thinking like computers or pencils or paper or stuff. That's what came to mind. The construction, I didn't even see how construction, I mean, basically, if you hit a 25% cost overrun on a project, on a construction project, we should have stopped it way before we got to the over 25%. So when I read this, I didn't think it had anything to do with construction, actually. I just thought it was like paper and pencils and.
Well, and it can be both, right? I mean, there's times that we come to the board and ask for an adjustment to the contract amount. We said we're gonna spend $2 million over 5, you're gonna see some of that at the next board meeting with the emergencies. We said we're gonna spend $2 million over the next 5 years, and now that, for roofing repairs, and now that we have this emergency, we're gonna have to raise that from $2 million to $4 million, right? So what we were trying to clarify is what to do for over 25%. We'll take your comments, and we're not trying to slow it down. We're trying to make it clear to everybody what we do in the process, and right now it's not clear. So we can go back and look at that, absolutely.
Please look at it. Thank you very much.
But it is not only construction, because you will see some of that next board meeting.
It just seems to me, so I think I still have the floor, Mr. Chair. It just seems to me that this is the type of accountability that we want, right? If these things are going in excess of, 20 some, there are things where you say, well, there could be, costs go up, fuel goes up tomorrow, and it goes up, 20%, and so that's what's throwing off this contract. But once you go a little bit above that, it seems to me that, you really probably should rebid the thing. We hear that a lot around the dais about, has this been competitively bid? Has this been competitively bid? This says, this is a trigger. You hit that 25%, rebid it. I like it. Thank you.
Thank you for relooking at that.
All right, page 14.
Okay, so on paragraph 2, under the goals, we currently are at 20 points. Based on the TASBO study, they were recommending 10 points, so that's in the suggested change. We did not change any of the goals from 30 to 35. But that was the first paragraph as it related to the actual points that are assigned. The program responsibilities, the TASB study, which we're not in this particular draft, not proposing that, but the TASBO study recommending these items of the program responsibilities to the policy manual. We have not, at this point, they're left in there with a few clarifications, but wanted to point out to the board that that was a recommendation, that it go to the procurement manual. Then on the committee, I will tell you that in practice, there have been committee members on there for numerous years. So one of the suggestions that came out of the committee was to make those individuals appointed, but by the board, and that those individuals' time on the committee would be linked to the trustee. So a new trustee coming in would be able to, if that was the case, they could be able to choose a new person without, as part of the process. But one important item is on the first paragraph, or the first add, that the advisory member will be a non-vendor appointee. We do have individuals on our committee now that are vendors. And so it was our suggestion that we would move that to a non-vendor. We would tie those committee members to a appointee of the trustee, that they could serve 2 terms. And then if a trustee changed out at any time in the middle or at the end of their term, the new trustee could then appoint someone.
Okay, I've got some questions and some concerns.
Trustee Foreman?
Starting with the overall MWBE points. I will not consider changing MWBE points until there is a look at the overall point system for all of procurement. I don't think you single out just the MWBE points. You have to look at what goes on with the full 100 points and not just the MWBE points. So I would not be supporting that at all. I will be supporting a strong look in the totality of how we award points, because I have some concerns with some of the things we do in terms of relationships with the district and awarding points for that. So I'm not going to be supporting that piece. For the appointees from the board for the MWBE committee, I don't believe that we should be saying non-vendors, because you want MWBEs on the committee. You want people, that's part of what's wrong, is people who don't really understand the relationship about being a small business and a minority business or a woman-owned business. What I do think is important is that person is not doing business with the district.
And that's what we meant.
Yeah, but that's not what it says.
And we
It says a
can-
non-vendor.
Right.
And so if it's a non-DISD vendor, I can accept that.
Okay.
But I wouldn't want to see a committee of a whole bunch of people sitting around talking about MWBEs and don't even know what the acronym is. That wouldn't make any sense.
And we can easily add non-DISD because that's what we intended.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with that, but I just don't think that's appropriate. Okay, I'm through for now.
And I made notes on the overall points. The only thing I would, just wanted to clarify is that was the recommendation of TASBO to go from 20 to 10. And those points are the only points that the board designates, right? The rest of the points are for administration to determine within that. I have no problem having discussions about those, the individual semantics of those items, but that within within the program of purchasing itself, all those points are designated according to administration. The only thing that's designated in policy is those the MWB points.
And I think that was designated in policy, particularly because there's been so much resistance to MWBE participation. And that years ago, that the policy was written to be able to make sure that there was the participation there. There's been resistance. It was resistance then, it's resistance now. And I think that's why that stays in policy, to ensure that something good happens and comes out of our MWBE program. And in fact, we have one of the leading MWBE programs in the city in terms of ensuring that ethnic minorities and women have an opportunity to participate for business in the district. And
No doubt.
we do. And
all I was just trying to indicate is that's the reason for the change.
yeah, and I would suggest that, Mr. Chair, is that change not be accepted at this time. And when we look at procurement in its totality, that then we would look at how we do that.
Okay. Trustee Flores?
So I think that the board forcing the 20% is the tail wagging the dog.
The board
I'm
didn't
not
force it.
I'm completely against it. I think we need to be at 10 or less, or let you guys figure out what that is. I've been sitting on the school board since 2005, and there has never been any resistance to the MWBE program by anybody that I've ever served with in all these years. And we can call Ron Price, we can call any of Jerome Garza, you can call Jack Lowe. all the great trustees I've served with, Nancy Bingham, nobody's ever objected to the program. We've all been fully supportive of the program. We've all fully supported, making sure that our vendors reflect our society and our community and our school district and our students and our parents and our families. So I'm not going to sit here and listen and say that there's been resistance, because there hasn't been. Since 2005, since I've been on this school board, there's never been a resistance to this policy. There's never been a resistance to making sure that our vendor pool and our spend reflects the community and the demographics of our community. So I'm not going to sit here and listen to that. Having said that, I think that it's important that we have this program. It's staying in policy. It's in policy, but it seems to me that the 10% is a best practice. We see it in other districts, and so that's what I'm going to be supporting. Thank you.
I think this is definitely a point of discussion to think about. I think there are points all around on this. As far as this goes, to Trustee Foreman's point, the number of points does have an impact. I think as we look at disparity study and as we look at the 100 points as a whole, this is definitely worth a conversation. What I would ask administration to do is take that, relook at it, take that in light of it, and come back to us about that. Again, regardless, this committee does not make any decision about it. This is something I know that our full board has a lot of thoughts on. I'm sure people have this all the time. So take that into account as we go forward. As you know, we have very differing thoughts across the board on this.
And Trustee Maggie, we have had internal conversations about the other points and how they're dispersed, but we did not want to propose or make any changes to anything that we're doing in relation to how those points are distributed until we had unveiled to this committee the potential change of the policy, because what we didn't want to do is make a change and it impact the policy and people saying we were circumventing this committee with making those changes. So we were very cognizant of that. We are having conversations about the various points and how they're assigned, so we'll continue to do that. This is just related to that particular section.
And the last thing I would add on that too is I think as you all look, I know we had a presentation yesterday from MWBE. In some aspects, we are knocking it out of the park around bond and construction, et cetera. In some areas like goods and services, we are not. We are far behind. Yeah. So what I would encourage as you think about this, rather than doing a blanket, if you're going to propose moving this for a discussion, maybe look at the areas where we're still struggling and making sure that it stays at 20. And then in specific areas where we know we have issue finding vendors to submit, et cetera, where there is a specific reason to talk about, perhaps bringing that to the discussion floor rather than a blanket, because I do hear Trustee Foreman's concerns on that. I also hear Trustee Flores' points that this is variable and you all know the landscape and a lot of that. So, I mean, this is definitely a meaningful topic that we discussed, but that would be my suggestion on how to look at that.
Can I ask a question regarding
Go
that? Because I'd like to go back further than 2005. In the 90s, I actually chaired this committee. And so I have a lot of history with this committee. And the question that I have in regards to the 20 points is that the 20 points was a decision made by the procurement department at that time, is how the MWBE department got the 20 points. They didn't just go pull the 20 points out of the air, correct? Don't know.
Yeah, you're asking
Most of
me.
y'all have been around as
You're-
long as
yeah.
me.
You're asking me a history
I'm a
that-
relic here, I understand that. So just please remember that this didn't just happen by happenstance. It happened for a reason, and the reason, again, was to ensure that ethnic minorities and women had an opportunity to participate. And I want to make sure that that continues to happen. I don't want to send people away from a program that has worked. Thank you.
All right, onward.
All right, so the committee itself, striking and changes continues on to page 15, and then we get into the MWBE program. And on 15, 16, and 17, 18 and halfway through 19 is related to the MWB program, and we believe that should go into the MWB program guide. A lot of this is just things they do, almost like a job description. Here are the things that they, functions they perform and so forth, and we believe that that should go into the MWB program guide.
So a question,
Yes, ma'am.
so is any of the language changing?
As I look through here,
It doesn't specify it in any of these
I don't see any,
guidelines.
I was looking through there, see, I don't see
Yeah, I
anything
don't
that, of
see
the
it, but I'm
language.
just trying to make sure, because this is kind of a blurred copy.
No, I was making sure on my notes that I didn't see anything was gonna change.
No
And I think to that, I think let's confirm that and figure out what that would look
I will.
like and bring that,
I will-
if there are any changes.
We'll
to
make sure
explicit
that
those.
if there is any, we'll identify those, but I don't believe that there were. So that brings us to page 19, which is sanctions. And so what we try to do is try to identify when and where sanctions are in place. What we were trying to say is, that the superintendent then has the authority to issue those sanctions based on those four criteria, and actually five, now we added disbarment for participating in future contracts. Because there was some vagueness in relation to, repeat violations, how many, 2, 3, 4, and so we were trying to identify that the superintendent's discretion, he could or she could do those sanctions.
What do other agencies do regarding that? Do we know?
We have their information, but I'd just have to review that. I don't.
Yeah,
I don't-
I'd like to know what other agencies, like the city and DART, NTTA, other agencies do, because we don't have to reinvent the landscape. In fact, we should, in the region, should be mirroring what each other are doing, because then they all know that we're all on the same page, as opposed to trying to come up with our own.
Okay, and we have those other agencies' information, so we can review that, see if it aligns to what we're having here.
Trustee Flores?
And then lastly, on that page, on page 19 was,
No, no,
I'm sorry.
go ahead
Sorry,
and
Trustee
finish.
Flores.
I'll
I'm sorry.
come back to it.
You can go ahead
Go
and
ahead.
continue.
Oh, sorry. So MWB concerns, just basically identify that goes to the district hotline to adhere to the rest of all the tips that we receive. They all go to the district hotline. So,
So I was just, because it has to do kind of with those last two items. So I'm all for listening to what other people do and, adding on to this list. I think that we have to hold our, people to a higher standard. We need to be a leader in this. We need to, let people know that we're serious about this, not only in terms of doing the procurement and, helping these businesses, move forward and reflecting our spend in the community, but also that we're going to hold them to a higher standard. I think we need to be the gold standard in this, especially in this section, and as many different types of options as the administration feels that they need. And I would actually list these as an and/or, because it could be any one of these things, not, the way that it's written right now, it's like it's this one or this one or this one. It could be and/or, any of these things or any other sanction,
Right, and-
necessary by the administration. Like, I'd leave it like open-ended, because if we're gonna be the gold standard, people need to know if they're cheating, they're not gonna do business with us, or depending on how bad it is, or just receive a warning or a reprimand or something like. But I think we need to be the gold standard.
And in
so
that
we're
regard, we-
proud of our program.
in that regard, we did discuss having included but not limited to in the language, but we had not placed that in there.
So the reason that I raised the issue about other agencies, other agencies already keep vendors who violate their policies from doing business. That already happens. And so, again, we're trying to recreate something that's already going on. And we just need to make sure that we look at what they're currently doing. I know this is something that we haven't done in the past, but we're not the gold standard. We're going to be coming behind some people who are already doing that. So.
Sounds like we're all in agreement to look at that and really make sure it's good.
Yes, absolutely.
So may I ask?
You got a question?
Well, just a point, you know, if the other agencies already have people that they've disbarred, and we should know about it, you know, and, you know, take that into consideration. Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the end of this policy. I think the ask on this policy is that you take those comments and concerns into account, take it back, engage the entire staff and the purchasing departments and everyone that is needed in that conversation, and then bring that back to us. So let's move from CH local to, which one's next? CV local?
Sure, CV local. Could you pull that up?
Page one.
Page one. Mercifully, it's only got 6 pages. All right, so CV local. So construction contracts, we raised the value to match the rest of the policy from 25 to 50. We made some clarifications on job order contract and actually lowered the threshold from 1 million to 500,000. On the contingency allowance, we included the word, or the words where appropriate, because not every project has to have a contingency.
So could you go back to the third paragraph
Yes, ma'am.
and some clarification? It says, prior to advertising, the board shall determine the project delivery contract award method to be used for each construction contract valued at or above $50 million.
50,000, yes, ma'am.
It doesn't look like 50,000 on here.
Well, it used to be 25,000,
I
now it's
can't-
50. Yeah,
I'm
it's,
telling you,
all the
this is-
zeros kind
Oh,
of,
yeah, this is crazy.
I would,
Okay.
I'd give you my
50,000 is
glasses, but it doesn't
good.
help
I'm
me either.
good. I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm
50,000.
good. I'm good.
So the contingency allowance just says it's not required, just where appropriate, we would use that. And then in final payment, we did make some changes to when the final payment would be made, basically to identify that the work has been complete. We would still, we did strike it out, but we need to change that, whether we still need to reference CS legal.
So could I ask about the contingency allowance?
Yes,
I
ma'am.
thought every construction contract had a contingency on it. So the way this reads, shall contain a contingency allowance where appropriate.
That's correct. So what we're allowing for is that the way it reads that out, it says shall contain. And if we determined that through the process that we didn't need a contingency, that would give us the allowance to, or the ability to not have a contingency. The way the policy writes now is we must have one. It says you shall have a contingency. So we were leaving the door open for a particular project that may not, based on our.
Do we have any numbers of construction contracts that did not have contingencies?
Our policy says we shall, so no, we do not now. But as we mentioned earlier, we have several, we probably have several projects over the course of time that had a contingency that didn't use any of it.
So do we know those? I'd just like to know, because I've seen in most cases that those contingencies are used for different things on the project. And
Yes, ma'am, and they are either on, for unforeseen items or additional items on the contract or on that particular project, absolutely. But what we wanted to allow for was if there is a case where we don't need a contingency, the current policy says we shall have
so
one.
who would make that determination?
It says there by the person administrating the contract.
So that
in
would be construction.
in this case, it would be Scott, yes, ma'am. Or Chief Lane.
Or Scott. I don't know, I just.
So all we were trying to do was just give us the flexibility, not saying that we'd ever have a contract without a contingency, just saying if we made the determination based on the project, that this gives us allowance to do that, the ability to do it. Otherwise, we always are going to have a contingency even if we know we're not going to use it.
But historically, we do use it.
I'm sorry?
Historically, we do use it. And that, to me, that's just, that's a concern. I think that's over-regulating, particularly if the contingency then, if it's not used, it goes back to the overall bond project, because that's usually what it is the bond. To me, that's just over-regulating and putting an additional step in. That's my opinion. Nobody else might not feel like that, but I'm an ex-construction purchasing agent.
I guess the way I saw
And
that,
construction is crazy, and particularly in the area that we're in, particularly constructing some of these old buildings, there are a lot of unforeseens in those projects. So I mean, it's just, I don't think that in the best interest to have the construction division worrying about if they can do a contingency or not. Or somebody coming in saying, oh, well, you don't really need to do a contingency on this project. I think you do the contingency, and then you, if it's not used, I think you regulate the contingency, but if it's not used, it goes back to the pot.
Trustee Flores?
So the current policy says that you shall have a contingency. This gives you guys more flexibility because it says where appropriate or if applicable. It doesn't matter which terminology you use, but basically this gives you more flexibility. Yes, sir.
that's correct. You would not have to have a contingency.
Okay, thank you.
I would just ask
And
that
so-
you look at it.
So I think what would be helpful then perhaps is to, if you can give us some insight when you consider this, like to say, here are the projects where we haven't used contingencies. These are the ones, because I think what I'm hearing from Trustee Foreman is if they're variable and random and we can't really predict which ones we don't need contingencies on, then why would we not build in a contingency? But if there's a type of project that consistently does not use contingency, but we're being forced to build it in anyways,
Yeah, I don't
It'd be
know that you're
helpful
going to, I don't, and I could be wrong, I don't know that you're going to find a particular type of construction that isn't using the contingency. We were just trying to allow for the possibility that you had determined that you did need one.
And I
But
think what I'm
we can
hearing-
definitely look at that percentage.
I think that would just help us understand if we were to take this out and give the flexibility, we would want to make sure that it doesn't result in a lot of projects that don't have contingencies that need them as we go forward. So if we just look at how many haven't used contingencies and if there's any trends on that, what types of projects we would not want to do contingencies with.
We can easily do that. I would anticipate that the majority, if not all of them, would still have contingencies.
Okay.
Just, I mean,
And if that's the-
if I was the person responsible for construction, that's a safeguard for you for the unforeseen items, even if you think it's very straightforward.
I got you. And if that's the case, if we always use those contingencies for the most part, then I think it's worth leaving in there. All right, carrying on. Page 2.
Page 2, we made reference to JOC projects, again, of 500,000 or more. Again, on this, at the bottom, back to the 10 points is again the same on construction as it is. The suggestion is the same as it was on goods or services. So, and see if there's any additional questions.
I think a lot of the same points that
Right,
were made in the
absolutely.
last one are going to hold true here. I think to the point of if there is a specific arena in which it is very difficult to procure vendors or whatnot, then let's talk about that. Take all of our viewpoints into account as you think about that and bring this back to us for discussion.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions on page 2?
I'm sorry, I'm behind. I'm still on one.
All right, page 3.
Okay, page 3, Made a few wording changes on the first paragraph to the superintendent or designee shall determine relevant factors as listed in request for bids or proposal instead of may. Made it definitive. Then down on architects, basically saying we're going to comply with law in selection of architects, engineers, and land surveyors.
Can I
Trustee
ask-
Foreman?
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit behind. I'm
Okay.
at the bottom of page 2. And when it talks about what our percentages are for construction projects, 35 and 30, 30% would be the construction. I think 35 is for professional services. But then I see on here a however. Many district contacts shall be assigned a contract-specific MWBE goal. It's kind of like in the middle of the paragraph. So when did we go to assigning specific MWBE goals on contracts, on capital improvement contracts, by the way, where we get our biggest bang in MWBE participation?
I'm going to have to go back and review that sentence. I don't recall that part of the conversation, so, and nor am I aware of any contracts being assigned specific goals. They're 30 and 35 are the goals.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so I need to go back and review that.
Please do.
Yeah, and I think if we've had it at 30, 35%, if there's not a specific reason for that,
Yeah,
then let's remove that and go with what we've
I'll
had
just
with
have to
30,
go back.
35%.
I don't, just right off the top of my head, I do not recall that conversation, nor is our intent to change the 30 or 35%.
Okay. Page,
That would
You got
be
something?
other questions.
I just deleted.
okay,
And I made that note.
page 3. So you already went through that. The questions on page 3. I do have a question where it talks about the shall determine, superintendent designee shall determine that, about the scoring methodology. We already have that set. I mean, how does this relate to the scoring methodology? Or right now, what the board has set as 80-20, and then the methodology is in between?
We just made it definitive that it's shall instead of may.
Okay, I got you.
Okay,
It doesn't change any of those other factors.
I got you, and that will be, as we talk about the scope of the project going on, if and when we revisit the whole 100 points, I think that'll be a different conversation.
So, under the selection of architects,
Yes, ma'am.
historically, the board has selected a group of architects. And within that group, in that selection was several ethnic minorities and women. This looks like a shift and a change. Is it or is it not?
No, what we were just identifying was that we will select architects, engineers, and those professional services according to the law and remove these particulars that were identified there. But it doesn't change that we'll bring that list to the board and it will still identify if they're MWBE qualified. It doesn't change that.
So somewhere in there, can we just kind of put a statement in there? I just want to make sure that there's not a shift
Okay,
based on this particular
I
statement.
understand.
So Dwayne, I strongly encourage us to follow all applicable law. Thank you.
I agree with that 100%. That's not what I'm talking about.
So if I can go on to page 4. Non-campus facility alterations, I mean, all of this is being struck. but we can put that particular item of non-campus facilities into the procurement manual. And then we struck all the way to the middle of page 5, identifying that all the definitions and so forth that are included above should be in the procurement manual. And that follows all the way to page 6. So all those definitions that are identified there would then go into either the purchasing manual, or if you want to call it the procurement manual, either way, all those items would be identified there as a part of the definition package.
Any questions on that? All right, so that brings us to the end of this. In the same way as CH Local, let's make sure to take into the account the concerns and questions. If y'all can revisit it with everybody that needs to, and then bring it.
The majority of the committee's here, so they all have heard the comments. So
All right, that's wonderful. Do we have any other policies to go over in this case?
The only other policy we've been working on is regulation, but we'll provide that to you in another form.
Yeah, and I do think it would be helpful for us to have the regulation policies to look at in conjunction, the proposed regulation, even though they're not going to go to vote, in conjunction with these for the discussion. Does anyone else have any other questions on either of this? All right, so the next steps, if y'all take that into account, revise those policies with those feedback, please send it back to us for a larger board discussion, and then we will, the scope of this committee, we will continue this to look at the overall procurement procedures as it relates going forward, separate from these policies. So,
Absolutely.
with that, the time is 4:36, and this meeting is adjourned.
See you, man.
See you. Have a great weekend. What are you gonna do to celebrate Marissa? What's she doing?
She's in LA.
Of course she is. I know that. But what's she doing? She's not telling you what her birthday?
Oh, she one of her friends, Isaiah.
Oh, nice.
He's having a
How's he
party.
doing?
Good, great. Yeah, he's having a party.
Of course he is.
They're probably gonna be roommates next